Well, we come to an interesting passage here in the light of Gideon's life, just to quickly give us a reminder of where we've been for the past couple chapters now. We have here in Gideon's story, one of the judges of Israel, sort of the longest, or one of the longer sections about a particular judge in Israel. Remember, we have had some who barely get a verse to them, others a section or a chapter, but Gideon gets a couple chapters, and it's because his story gives us a lot of lessons and a lot of perspectives. And one thing that I think is helpful as we've gone through the book of Judges is to realize, and we said this morning, that the people that God chooses to use are very normal people who have the same sorts of hang-ups and issues that we all have. Human nature hasn't really changed that much over the millennia. And so I think there's encouragement here just to read of the lives of men and women who really did stumble and falter at times in the same ways we do, and yet also could be used mightily of God as Gideon is. And Gideon, as we saw early in chapter 6 or through chapter 6, was someone who was always doubtful. He was reluctant. He wasn't sure of himself, and in being unsure of himself, was unsure of the Lord. And we saw him testing the Lord, and the Lord being gracious to accommodate him and to heed, or even condescend to those testings. We saw in Judges chapter 7 that God had laid out this audacious plan that Gideon, with 300 other men, would take on a force of almost 135,000 and defeat them in battle, using nothing but torches and horns. We saw how that went, and as Gideon defeated Midian, we now come to this pursuit of two kings of Midian. And this is going to be interesting today for a few reasons, and one of them is that there is kind of a debate amongst commentators about whether what Gideon does here is godly or a personal vendetta, about whether these actions of Gideon are noble or ignoble, meaning they are not to be replicated. So that's sort of going to be a running theme by the end of it. Maybe you'll land on something. I'll land on a position, but maybe you'll go one side or the other. But it offers an interesting perspective to read through this and wonder, well, was Gideon right in what he did? Because there are some areas where Gideon really tested the Lord and others where he was obedient. So which one was this one? All right. So let me read then the passage for you, or we'll just take it in chunks. But we begin in Judges chapter 8, verse 4. And Gideon came to the Jordan and crossed over. Now remember, he's pursuing. They started in the valley of Jezreel, and they've driven the Midianite forces east toward the Jordan River. You can look on the back of your handouts if you want to see a map of how that went. And now they're about to cross the Jordan into the area what's sometimes called the Transjordan, which is really just the land to the east of the Jordan River. Gideon came to the Jordan, crossed over, he and the 300 men who were with him, exhausted yet pursuing. So he said to the men of Sukkot, "Please give loaves of bread to the people who follow me, for they are exhausted, and I am pursuing after Zebah and Zalmunna, the kings of Midian." And the officials of Sukkot said, "Are the hands of Zebah and Zalmunna already in your hand that we should give bread to your army?" So Gideon said, "Well then, when Yahweh has given Zebah and Zalmunna into my hand, I will flail your flesh with the thorns of the wilderness and with briars." And from there he went up to Penuel and spoke to them in the same way. And the men of Penuel answered him as the men of Sukkot had answered. And he said to the men of Penuel, "When I come again in peace, I will break down this tower." Well, what's going on here is that Gideon's men, after really running and chasing the Midianite army for miles, they come to the Jordan chasing 15,000 men. We'll see that number later, but they're chasing 15,000 of the 135,000 who were arrayed for battle, and they've crossed the Jordan into a land that is occupied by Israelites. Who are the men of Sukkot? Well, remember that when the Israelites were wandering through the wilderness, and Moses led them to the cusp of the promised land, some of the tribes wanted to stay on the east side of the Jordan, or the Transjordan. And there was a concern because Moses was concerned, Joshua was concerned, well, the fight is on the other side of the Jordan River. So it's sort of concerning that you're on the opposite side here. And if you read Numbers 32, you can see how this pans out. But essentially, these tribes, a few tribes, say, well, listen, when you go and you fight those Canaanites, we'll definitely come. We'll definitely come and we'll fight alongside you. And they did for their part. But in Numbers 32, there is a concern that's sort of like, but you're going to be sort of far from us. And it's going to maybe cause some conflict. And as it turns out, that's what happens. The tribe of Gad was one of those tribes, and these men of Sukkot were part of that tribe. Now, their hostility, it represents the breakdown of the unity. That is part of the consequences that we see in the book of Judges of everyone doing what's right in their own eyes. Remember, that's sort of a phrase that comes up in the book of Judges, is that when they depart from the Lord, everyone starts to do what's right as it seems to them, and that is a recipe for disunity. Because if you're doing what's right in your own eyes, I'm doing what's right in my own eyes, well, then we're just going to go and do our thing over here. You go ahead and do your thing over there. And it seems that the tribe of Gad, especially exacerbated by the fact that there is this natural kind of border between them, has grown distant in terms of their allegiance and their loyalty to the people of Israel. It's a sad testimony that rather than being enthusiastic, or at least helpful to what the Lord was doing through Gideon and throwing off the shackles of these Midianite oppressors, they were instead antagonistic. And you see it here in that response of theirs where they say, are the hands of Zebah and Zalmunna already in your hand, that we should give bread to your army? There's a word play going on here that's not quite as obvious in English, but in English you have two uses of the word hand there, right? Are their hands in your hand, so to speak? But there's two different words in Hebrew. And the idea is this: the first one, referring to the hands of Zebah and Zalmunna, that refers to like the palm, literally the hand. Meaning, in the ancient, Near East, it was very common that when you went into battle and you captured your enemy, you might cut off some body parts to prove that you have defeated such and such person. So to cut off the hands of your enemies it's brutal. It's meant to be brutal, but it was a demonstration that we have defeated these people. And so the people of Sukkot are pointing out, are the hands of these two kings with you right now, that you can ask of us this thing. Now, the second word for hand is a very commonly used in the Old Testament, yad, if you are keeping track of the Hebrew. And it can be used literally to refer to your hand, but often it's used figuratively. Like, the hand of the Lord was upon me. It's not a literal hand being upon you, but God's power and authority. That's the second word there. In other words, they're saying, you haven't captured those kings yet, so you don't have authority over us. Are the hands of the Zebah and Zalmunna, do you have them in your hand, in your power and authority? No. So why should we submit to your authority if you don't have their literal hands? It's also another way of implying that they still thought the Midianites were over them, that Gideon did not have authority over them. This is not only then, at best, snarky and sarcastic, it implied that they thought the Midianites were still in charge, and perhaps that Gideon would not accomplish his mission in bringing those two men captive. So their refusal to give food is just, it's basic, not hospitable, which in that culture, you were hospitable. Even if your enemy asked for bread, you would give it to them. But it also reveals that they didn't really think that Gideon was, that they should be loyal to Gideon, and therefore to the Israelites people, and therefore to God. I think one thing that, in terms of application here is, how should we respond when brothers, in the Lord, act as rivals in this way? Because they are still related. I mean, this is still their people. This is not an enemy tribe. Or an enemy people. This is Gad. It's one of the 12 tribes. And so what do you do now? We don't have tribes and things like that in church, but there are times when we might be opposite or opposed to someone that, we're fellow Christians and believers with. Well, I think one thing that is helpful is Paul's attitude in the book of Philippians. If you want to turn there in Philippians 1, he's in prison here, and there are folks who are opportunizing on Paul's imprisonment to make their stock go up higher since Paul's is lower. And he says this in verse 15, Philippians 1. So he talks about how some people are being more bold to preach the gospel because he's in prison, because they're confident. They're not fearing. They see Paul not fearing imprisonment, and it's making them bold to also preach the gospel and not fear imprisonment as well. But then there's some others, Paul says, Philippians 1:15, some indeed preach Christ from envy and rivalry, but others from goodwill. The latter do it out of love, knowing that I'm put here for the defense of the gospel. The former proclaim Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, but thinking to afflict me in my imprisonment. What then? Only that in every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is proclaimed, and in that I rejoice. Now, this isn't exactly the same situation, of course, as Gad and Gideon, but I think what Paul is getting at is he's not going to be jealous or bitter just because someone else might be in a position to succeed more than him. He is in prison. He can't go out and be pastoring churches and going out and planting churches as he was accustomed to. And there are others then who are filling in that gap. And I think this is just a way of Paul saying, I'm not going to be jealous of them. Jealousy just punishes yourself for what someone else is achieving. Or as some have put it, jealousy is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. So he knows there's no reason to be jealous here or bitter or envious about the situation. Rather, to be thankful if God is using it for any good at all. Now, that is, I think, a godly way to approach a situation where you might feel like you're at odds with a brother or at rivals or having a disagreement, or even at worst, feeling like when you really strongly believe the other person is not having a godly attitude about it. Well, if there is any good that is coming from them, be thankful about that. Now, again, Gad is a little different, and we're going to see a consequence come for them. But for our own heart's sake, better to not let jealousy or envy stew in your hearts. Now, as we come into it, we're getting hinted at that there's a punishment or consequence that's going to come for them being traitorous. And here I just want to add some comments, and there's going to be basically, again, two camps, where one is going to see how Gideon treats Sukkot and Penuel as over the top and unnecessary, and there's others who are going to think that this was totally warranted and justified. So Daniel Block, who's more in the this was not warranted camp, he's going to give some observations that juxtapose the previous narrative and story about Gideon and this current one, and draw out some parallels. He says, firstly, Yahweh is not involved in this phase of the plot at all, except in Gideon's own glib comments. Meaning, Yahweh, remember when they attacked the encampment, 135,000 people? Yahweh is the one that caused the disarray, right? Here, you don't have any mention except 2 times of God or Yahweh, except Gideon making mention of him. So that's what Daniel Block means by that. Secondly, the 2 captured Midianite leaders have strange names and are called kings rather than commanders. So if you remember before, these princes or commanders of the army they captured already. Thirdly, the campaign takes Gideon and his men far afield to Karkor, east of the Dead Sea. Fourthly, Gideon runs into serious conflict with his Transjordanian countrymen. Fifthly, Gideon is personally involved in the capture and execution of the enemy kings. Sixthly, personal blood vengeance replaces national deliverance as a motive for Gideon's action. That refers to what's going to happen with the kings. And 7, Gideon, the fearful young man, has become a brutal aggressor. So he's showing his hand there. So there's one perspective. We'll share another one in just a moment. Next, a harsh response then is met with a harsh consequence. You see there that Gideon was going to come back after defeating the kings, and he's going to thresh them with thorns and branches. And this is possibly what he means is he's going to put a heavy weight on them and then drag them through thorns and briars the way that on a threshing floor you would put the grains on the floor and you'd drag a heavy weight over them to crush the grains so that the chaff can be then blown away and the grains could be kept. And the idea is, well, we're going to use you to do that, but it's not going to be grain, it's going to be prickly bushes. It's kind of a graphic thing. Now, it's interesting because how does Gideon's story start? Do you remember? He's at a threshing floor, or he's threshing wheat, but he has to do it at a vineyard, not a threshing floor, because they have to do it secretly because the Midianites, if they saw someone threshing on the open, they would come in and steal your grain. So he's doing it in this little vineyard. So this is one of those things where a commentator would be like, see, you used to be the kind of guy that would hide in threshing your grain, and now you're being so aggressive, you're going to thresh people. And they say, maybe this is not a good place for your heart to be. This punishment is intended to be a publicly shaming thing. It's a humiliation. It's not meant to kill them. It's meant to make a lesson out of them. And we'll see that more clearly when we get there. Likewise with Penuel, when they respond the same as Sukkot does, Gideon says he's going to break down their tower. And this would be a defensive watchtower. It would be a very important piece of their town defensive system. And so it's not a small thing to say, I'm going to destroy that which is supposed to protect you, because maybe you are trusting in your watchtower to save you from the Midianites and now from me, but it will not be enough. I will destroy it. What hints at something kind of sinister, though, is that Gideon says that when he comes again in peace, he's going to break, right? And that sounds a little bit like bad guy language. Say, when I come back here, I'm going to peacefully destroy your watchtower. And so some would see that and say, Gideon, I don't know if that's a particularly great attitude to have in your heart, especially since it's going to be a much harsher punishment later. Men are going to die. So one of the questions is, why didn't Gideon treat Gad the way he treated the Ephraimites? Remember, last time we talked in the book of Judges, in Judges 8:1-3, remember there's a conflict with the men of Ephraim, another tribe of Israel, and they were upset that Gideon seemed to go into battle without them and all these things, right? And he handled it in a very diplomatic and understanding way. If you remember, we brought up that Proverbs, that a gentle answer turns away wrath. And here, he's very diplomatic, very humble, very self-deprecating in order to make peace with another tribe of Israel. Here, he seems much more hostile. Is Gideon just hangry? He's hungry, and so, he's upset and emotional? Is this righteous retribution against traitors to Yahweh? Is there a difference between the Ephraimites and Gad? It's a good question to ask. I think there is a difference, but that's a good question to ask. Now, the way that, we'll come back to it. We'll come back to it, in other words. Now, the way that the Israelites engaged in warfare here it doesn't necessarily mirror how the church should respond. So say that someone is hostile. The first kind of application talking about rivalries or disagreements or people are brothers, but why are you acting this way? But what about someone who is just blatantly disregarding the word of God or is hostile to the word? Well, there's two camps for that in the New Testament. You have those that are genuinely enemies of the gospel, not Christian, and Romans 12 gives us some instruction about how to handle that. What do you do when someone is just blatantly hostile to you? Romans 12, sort of what actually Rich brought up just a little moment ago. We can start in verse 16, Romans 12:16. Live in harmony with one another. Do not be haughty, but associate with the lowly. Never be wise in your own sight. Repay no one evil for evil, but give thought to do what is honorable in the sight of all. If possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. Beloved, never avenge yourselves, but leave it to the wrath of God. For it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. To the contrary, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him something to drink. For by doing so, you will heap burning coals on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. Romans 12:16 through 21. And so there you get the sense if someone is very hostile, even your enemy, you should still try to live at peace with them. You don't need to be best friends with them, but if they come to you in desperation or need, you feed them. To a certain degree, Gad, even if you thought, this is the Old Testament quote, actually, love your enemies. Even if you thought that Gideon was your enemy, you still should have fed them. So we are called, at least in one sense, when someone's hostile to us or disobedient to the word, we still love them. We leave vengeance to the Lord. But there is room for giving consequences to the unrepentant believer. There are, for the most part, when we talk about enemies, we're talking about people who are not Christian. But when you're talking about Christians who are being blatantly disobedient to the word and unrepentant, we do have discipline options, but it's not a sword and it's not briars and thorns. Instead, we have a process called church discipline, which Jesus himself gives as a directive in Matthew chapter 18. And I'll just, sort of quickly sum it up. But in essence, if a Christian is caught in their sin, you are to try and make peace with them, call them to repentance. But if they do not and will not repent of their sin, they are to be told to the church what they are doing, and then they shall be, as Jesus says, to you as a Gentile and a tax collector. A formal term is excommunication, but that just means that they are told that you cannot associate yourself as a believer in this church because you are not acting like one. We see an example of it in 1 Corinthians 5, if you want to go there, to see how that kind of worked out in the life of the Corinthian church. But the point is, there is consequence for believers in a social or a church context for dealing with those who are unrepentant in their sin. And it's church discipline, not punishment, certainly not corporal punishment like pain or imprisonment or anything, but simply to say, and this should be a soul-searching moment for someone, for you to be told your sin means that you cannot be a part of the church family. It is a leaven. It is a cancer on us that if we allow it, it'll turn all of us astray. So you cannot associate with us. You cannot be associated with the church of God for your own soul's sake. So those are, in the New Testament anyway, applications for how we address those who would be hostile, disobedient to the gospel, and disobedient to the Lord. So we have this punishment looming over Sukkot and Penuel, as Gideon and his 300 men, go forth to pursue these two Midianite kings. Verse 10 of Judges 8. Now Zebah and Zalmunna were in Karkor with their army, about 15,000 men, all who were left of all the army of the people of the east. For there had fallen 120,000 men who drew the sword. So in total, 135,000. And Gideon went up by the way of the tent dwellers east of Nobah and Yogbeha and attacked the army, for the army felt secure. And Zebah and Zalmunna fled, and he pursued them and captured the 2 kings of Midian, Zebah and Zalmunna, and he threw all the army into a panic. Now, some of these locations and place names aren't known, but you can look on the map on the back of the handout for a general idea of the region we're looking at. The exact place doesn't necessarily matter. But Gideon is said to take a route here used by tent dwellers, meaning nomadic people. Nomadic people, they pitch a tent in a camp. They're only there for a few days while their animals graze, and then once all the food has been eaten, they pick up and they move and they go somewhere else. You can go to Israel now, and there's still nomadic peoples there. Well, at least 20 years ago there was, who lived that way, if not in Israel, then other places in the Middle East. So this would have been not a well-known route. It would have been less traveled, and of course perfect for setting up an ambush. And this is technically the second ambush of the Midianite army. The remaining army is caught totally unawares, without any defenses up, because they thought that they were safe. And like before, the army is thrown into a panic. Again, just a little kind of a comment. Here it says that Gideon threw all the army into a panic, versus in the previous chapter, verse 22, Yahweh set every man's sword against his comrade and against all the army. It was something Yahweh did to disrupt and cause the chaos in the camp. God did it there. Here, doesn't seem like Yahweh is mentioned. Again, just a little bit of an observation there. Now, it's interesting that there is no strange strategy like before. Before, the strategy is torches and horns, ram's horns that they blew, right? Again, maybe another sign that this is not a divinely ordered pursuit, that Gideon's may be acting on his own initiative, and we'll see why he might be doing this in just a moment. But on the other hand, because I know I'm giving, sort of one side there, on the other hand, Gideon was bold enough to attack 15,000 with 300. Now, yes, 135,000 versus 300 was impressive, but 300 versus 15,000 is also still impressive. It takes a lot of confidence to do that. And so there is a sense there, while maybe God's name is not spoken, the fact that they did engage 300 versus 15,000 and win, that does suggest maybe the Lord is in it and the Lord is behind it and empowering it. And that would be an argument that Gideon is trusting the Lord in all of this. Now, much can be said in terms of application about having confidence in the Lord, about being willing to pursue even a battle that seems almost impossible. We spoke this morning about confidence, or Paul's confidence, which was not in his own great power and might, but his weakness. 2 Corinthians 12, where he said, "Then I'll boast all the more in my weakness. For when I am weak, he is strong," or I am strong. The strategy, as we've been saying, all through Joshua and Judges, the strategy has always been trusting obedience. It wasn't about how many troops they had. It wasn't about their battle experiences. It wasn't about their soldiers and their armaments. It was about them trusting the Lord and being obedient to him. And here's the great thing. Here's the great thing about saying that no matter how weak you might feel, no matter how bad you think your situation is, you are always able, by the power of Christ, to trust and obey. That's what is incredible about this, about the fact that it's about faithful, trusting obedience to the Lord, is that you can do that. You can do that no matter where you are. You can do that no matter how many fingers and limbs you have. You can do that no matter how old or young you are. You can do that no matter whether you have a job, don't have a job, whether you're rich or whether you're poor, whether your parents are together or divorced, whether you've had abuse in your life. You can always trust and obey and experience Christ's power. So that is, I think, an amazing truth. There's no formula. There's no situation where you are without the empowerment of the Lord, just by trusting and obeying. It's a wonderful thought. It should be very comforting to us. Well, moving on in the story, after these kings are captured, verse 13, then Gideon, the son of Joash, returned from the battle by the ascent of Heres, and he captured a young man of Sukkot and questioned him. And he wrote down for him the officials and elders of Sukkot, 77 men. And he came to the men of Sukkot and said, behold, Zebah and Zalmunna, about whom you taunted me, saying, are the hands of Zebah and Zalmunna already in your hand, that we should give bread to your men who are exhausted? And he took the elders of the city, and he took thorns of the wilderness and briars, and with them taught the men of Sukkot a lesson. And he broke down the tower of Penuel and killed the men of the city. Just real fast, it's interesting that there's a reference to reading and writing, that this young boy could read and write, presumably, and so could Gideon and his men. There is sometimes a criticism that, and this is before we found, frankly, a lot of evidence for these writings, that the Israelites couldn't have possibly had something like a Bible. That this is all relatively recent, writings. Now, we have since then found more older ones, but the very claim of the Bible was, until we found the evidence, that no, the people of Israel in the 1500s, 1400s BC could have a whole written text. The Old Testament, or at that time, the Torah, Moses, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. It's entirely possible that they could have those books. Now we know, because of the evidence, that there was writing in this region at this time. But understand, for a while, people said, no way that they were literate. No way could they have written all these texts and passed that down. Well, joke was on them. A lot of them secular archaeologists. We have found that they were. We can talk more about that, but I think that's fascinating. I actually can talk to Aaron about that once he's done, because that's part of what he's doing his dissertation on. But the war trophies now are presented before Sukkot and Penuel. Gideon taunts them just as they had taunted him when he asked for their help. So is this childish, or is this poetic justice that he is bringing? Kind of depends, right? Again, that's sort of the question. Now, Gideon punishes the leadership to teach them a lesson, or literally in the Hebrew is to make them know, to let them know something is literally how it goes. But taught them a lesson is the idea of it. Now, it's discipline, not killing, that was the goal, at least in Sukkot. But in Penuel, it's not likely that he killed all the men of Penuel, but at least perhaps the leaders or elders of the city, or those who are most mocking and taunting when he came there. But the consequence does seem harsher than you might expect, because Sukkot is just really physical humiliation, public humiliation, physical pain. But here, he not only destroys the tower, like he said, but he kills at least some of the men of that city, despite saying, when I come again in peace, I will break down this tower. Was Gideon allowing vindictiveness to enter his heart? Did he get a bloodlust after he punished the people of Sukkot? Did he say, you know what, that wasn't enough. Penuel, some of your men are going to have to die. Again, Block says, Gideon's behavior could be justified if Penuel were a Canaanite city. But these were fellow Israelites. His character has been transformed again. He acted like a general out of control, no longer bound by rules of civility, let alone national loyalty. On the other hand, Warren Wiersbe says, Well, why didn't Gideon show to the people of Sukkot and Penuel the same kindness that he showed to the Ephraimites and simply forgive them for their offense? For one thing, their offenses were not alike. The pride of Ephraim was nothing compared to the rebellion of Sukkot and Penuel. Ephraim was protecting their tribal pride, a sin but not a costly one. But Sukkot and Penuel were rebelling against God's chosen leader and assisting the enemy at the same time. Theirs was the sin of hardness of heart toward their brethren and treason against the God of heaven. Of what good was it for Gideon and his men to risk their lives to deliver Israel if they had traitors right in their own nation? Leaders must have discernment or they will make wrong decisions as they deal with different situations. Personal insults are one thing, but rebellion against the Lord and his people is quite something else. So Warren Wiersbe there is more on the side of, no, this is righteous judgment and punishment for traitors against the Lord. Well, following the judgment that he brought to that city, we come now back to the kings of Midian, who are going to be executed finally as the final act of Gideon's freeing the people from the Midianite oppression. Verse 18. Then he said to Zebah and Zalmunna, "Where are the men whom you killed at Tabor?" They answered, "As you are, so were they. Every one of them resembled the son of a king." And he said, "They were my brothers, the sons of my mother. As Yahweh lives, if you had saved them alive, I would not kill you." So he said to Jether, his firstborn, "Rise and kill them." But the young man did not draw a sword, for he was afraid, because he was still a young man. Then Zebah and Zalmunna said, "Rise yourself and fall upon us, for as the man is, so is his strength." And Gideon arose and killed Zebah and Zalmunna, and he took the crescent ornaments that were on the necks of their camels. Now, executing these enemy kings, that would have been expected. So them being executed was not unusual. But Gideon does make it personal. He brings up an incident where likely it seems these men, and not in some remote way, but somehow directly involving these two Midianite kings, they were responsible for the deaths of Gideon's blood brothers, meaning full brothers, because he says the sons of my mother. If you know your Old Testament, you see it a lot. This was never ordained by God, but frankly, a lot of men had multiple wives. So you could have a lot of half-brothers, because you had different mothers. But when Gideon says, these were the sons of my mother, he's saying, these were my full-blood brothers that you killed at Tabor. And he asks them about them, and they respond that they were like every one of them the son of a king, as you are. Now, is this the Midianites trying to flatter Gideon to save their lives? He's saying, these were these were such manly men. These are such strong men. Or are they bragging and taunting Gideon? Like, yeah, every one of them was like you, so mighty and proud, but we killed them all the same. It's hard to say. Some of it does depend on whether you think Gideon is acting, again, out of his own initiative or out of a divine mandate. Because if the idea here is that they're bragging about it and goading Gideon into response, then you might say, well, Gideon fell into a trap here, that he's going to do something out of a personal vendetta and vengeance rather than something of the Lord. And maybe they're just trying to stumble him in that way. Now, there's no question that these men, both by their status as these enemy kings, were going to die. They're Canaanite kings. God had given the Israelites at the time a judgment to bring against the Canaanite people and to wipe them out. We talked about that in Joshua. But here, would it be right for Gideon, let's say, to do a right thing, which is to bring these two kings to judgment for a wrong motive or a personal vendetta? Well, it depends on what you think about whether what Gideon did was right or not. Now, Gideon responds, and we're gonna circle back to the end. We'll talk about it a little bit, and you can actually respond to it a little bit. But Gideon responds with perhaps not a legitimate threat. or comment, meaning he says, well, if my brothers were still alive, your lives would have been spared. I don't know if that's true or not. I mean, these are two Midianite kings. You have to conquer them because they're the ones who've been oppressing you. You can't let them live because they could foment another rebellion. So they were going to die no matter what. If that's the case, then it comes off as Gideon invoking Yahweh's name just to make a point, rather than seriously invoking God's name. And so that would be a ding against Gideon's motive here. Now, on the other hand, this is such an interesting passage. On the other hand, Gideon does say, when he says, as Yahweh lives, maybe he's actually referencing something. And in Deuteronomy 19:6 and 12, and in Numbers 35, it talks about an avenger of blood. Meaning if someone in your family was killed, back in those days when you didn't have like FBI or police or sheriff's departments or anything, someone killed your family member, you would have to go get justice yourself. And that was expected. That was normative. And in those passages, God was setting up cities of refuge where at least someone who might have been accused of manslaughter, not murder, could flee to one of these cities of refuge and not be killed. But it would not have been unusual if someone murdered a family member for you to go and seek justice and bring vengeance and kill the one who murdered your family member. So some would say, well, no, Gideon is being totally righteous here because his brothers were murdered. And he's just bringing vengeance upon these kings. Yeah, it sort of depends. How do you see Gideon here? Now, Gideon then tries to get his young son, Jether, his firstborn son, to do the execution. Now, young here can mean from like toddler to a young man. And the fact that he has a sword to draw implies that he can carry a sword. He's old enough to carry a sword. But it's also likely he wasn't one of the 300 that went with Gideon, meaning that he probably wasn't old enough to fight in the battle. Old enough to maybe train or pull some guard duty, but not really old enough to fight. And clearly too young enough to feel afraid about killing another man. Now, Gideon's motive here is likely to add more humiliation to Zebah and Zalmunna's death, since being killed by a kid would have been more shameful than dying in battle, or at least at the hands of an executioner or another king, right? It would have been much more humiliating to die accidentally. We even see this with Saul. If you remember, he's wounded and he wants someone else to finish him off because it's like kind of a shameful way to die, just being wounded out of nowhere by an arrow. So that shame and honor kind of culture, it would have been very shameful to be killed by a kid, right? John MacArthur, commenting on this, thinks that Gideon was trying to bestow a great honor on his son to allow him to kill them. I don't know if that's a good motive or not, but we can't say for sure. Either way. Again, some of it depends on what you think about Gideon. Was he trying to bestow an honor, or was he just trying to humiliate these two men who killed his brothers as much as possible? Essentially, they request that when they say, ride yourself, for as a man is, so is his strength, they're basically asking, we'd much rather you kill us than your son. Would have been certainly cleaner and faster, because if the kid was too weak, you could just imagine stabbing and hacking and hacking and hacking. It would have been a miserable, again, very humiliating death to die that way as well. And so Gideon does end up accommodating that request. Was it the right thing to do? Gideon, what were your motives here? Now here's the problem. The text offers no commentary on anything that's happening here. If you notice, as you read this passage, it is just narrative. There's no comments. There's no, the author inputting, something that might lean you one way or the other. It doesn't mention Yahweh doing anything, God doing anything in here. Just Gideon invokes Yahweh. There is almost no real way to fall, I think, on a very firm position on this. Because I can see sort of both ways. Now, some might say, well, if you knew the Hebrew culture and the context a lot more clearly, maybe you could pick up on something, but there's a reason that commentators who are brilliant, smart, very learned men, scholars, can fall on both sides of this equation. What do I think? And we can talk about this if you want over dinner. I'll tell you what I think. Because there's a lack of commentary on this, I think you can say definitely, for sure, is that these traitorous brethren and Sukkot and Penuel, they did deserve consequences for their disloyalty. I think we can say clearly that they needed to be rebuked or corrected or disciplined in some way. I think anybody, and we'd all agree on that they were rightly punished. On the other hand, the actions towards Penuel especially, and maybe even these two Midianite kings, it can seem a little excessive. That Gideon maybe was also wrong. Yes, he displayed great boldness in pursuing the Midianite armies, but you just get these sprinkles and these hints that this was like, a little bit was kind of a personal vendetta that he had. So the text is slightly, well, not slightly, I think it's pretty agnostic about landing on that, but I think you can hear by the tone of what Gideon says, when I come again in peace, I'll break down this tower, and then he kills a bunch of the men. When he's asking his son, who seems too young to be an executioner, when he's asking him to kill these men, probably to humiliate them more, make a lesson of them, just like he made a lesson of those at Penuel. I think you can see that there's maybe some flaws in Gideon's character, especially since we have seen some of his flaws even leading up to all of his mighty deeds here. And maybe this is a little bit of the clincher. What happens next in the life of Gideon, which we'll talk about next time, is that he ends up making a garment. And he makes it out of the garments of these kings, and it becomes a snare to Gideon and his family in verse 27. So it's almost like, if you think there's kind of a poetry here, that perhaps how he treated those Midianite kings were not right, and because of that, he didn't have the right motive. Because of that, they kind of got a revenge, in their garments. The crescent ornaments that are mentioned there in verse 21, they come back because they're used to make this garment that becomes a snare to them. So I think when you add it all together, yeah, Gideon, maybe this wasn't your best moment either. Well, that's something fair to say for all of us, that we are we are often flawed in how we try to obey the Lord. Sometimes it's a mix of motives. Sometimes we do some of the things the right way, and then other parts of it we really botch up, even in the same day, even in the same ministry. Just ask your spouse, if you're married, how that can be so, where 1 minute you're just firing all cylinders. It's like you just know your wife, and then the next you're just sticking your foot in your mouth and just, what are you doing? Gideon, again, a man like the rest of us. It is not to say that the Lord did not use him. It is not to say that his actions, at least some of them, were the right thing to do. It's just to say that he is like us, flawed as a leader. And another indication, as with many of the judges, that the Israelites needed a perfect judge, a perfect king to rule over them without any of the flaws, who wouldn't die but live forever. In all of the judges, we are to have this hint here, not so much a hint, but even this repetition of an idea that God raises up these rulers and these saviors, but if they come from amongst sinners, it's going to be a flawed salvation in a sense, because they're going to go back right into sin again. We need a savior and a judge and a king who can save perfectly. So even here we have this hint, this echo that this problem can only resolve in a God king who's also a man. And of course, We know that the Old Testament and the New Testament speak of Jesus Christ as being that God and that man in one, who saves his people by dying for them, rising again, conquering sin and death. He does not have to kill Midianites. He does not have to conquer nations and governments. He does it by serving and loving and sacrificing. That is the way of our King. We see how it does not work here. Sukkot and Penuel, they're going to get the lesson, maybe for a short time. They'll be right back in sin. The Midianites, they're not going to not be a temptation to the people of Israel just because their kings are dead. We see the flaw in the ways of man. And so here we see also just that hand that directs to Jesus Christ. Now, if you're not a Christian this evening, the same Jesus Christ is offering salvation to you out of your cycle of sin and success, out of your own cycle of feeling the highs of things going your way and then the crash when so many things that are outside of your control bring you down. There's a way to be outside of that cycle of sin, of regret, of going down dark paths and dangerous ways in your life. Jesus Christ offers salvation for you so that you can have, again, a power to be faithfully obedient in any circumstance and situation and be pleasing to the Lord no matter where you are, because you can believe in him and trust in him at any moment. If you're not a Christian, I'd urge you to consider who Jesus is as this perfect Savior who can save us and make us holy like he is holy. But only if you turn away from your sin, only if you reject those false ways of doing what's right in your own eyes. But he will save and he will forgive. If you are a Christian, I just found this interesting how Paul thought of traitors, because he was betrayed in his life as well. And we'll kind of close here in 2 Timothy. I've been very blessed by the life of Paul these days, and I don't mean any particular passage, but just getting this composite image of Paul as the pastor, as a man just like us, but called by the Lord, his attitude in adversity, his response to people and disappointment. I just have been learning so much, and this is one of those passages where it just gets very real for me, because he talks about, as he is writing to Timothy on death row, he's going to die soon for the faith. People are leaving him, abandoning him. Demas is in love with the present world, he says in 2 Timothy 4:9. You have Alexander, the coppersmith, who did great harm to him. But what does he say in verse 14? The Lord will repay him according to his deeds. Verse 16, at my first offense, no one came to stand by me, but all deserted me. May it not be charged against them. But the Lord stood by me and strengthened me, so that through me the message might be fully proclaimed and all the Gentiles might hear it. So I was rescued from the lion's mouth. The Lord will rescue me from every evil deed and bring me safely into his heavenly kingdom. To him be the glory forever and ever. Amen. Paul, in the face of his own traitors, was able to say, but even that, God is going to use for the furtherance of the gospel. And if that's really what matters to you as a Christian, you can handle being betrayed. I'm needing to learn that myself. As I get older, there's more opportunities to be betrayed, I suppose. But Paul was so singularly focused on the gospel going forth. He could see the way in which even those betrayals would serve to further the mission, so that he could even say, may not be charged against them. To leave judgment, the Lord will repay him according to his deeds. To say, finally, that God is going to bring me safely into his heavenly kingdom, no matter what happens. Don't need to pursue personal vendettas. Romans 12, like we said, love your enemy. Leave vengeance to the Lord. James 1:20, the anger of man does not produce the righteousness of God. Better spent is our time and our heart and attitude to continue to be about the mission, the gospel going forth into the uttermost parts of the world. So hopefully there's some encouragement there for you here in the book of Judges.